8-bit joystick. As the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2 gets ever so closer, now just weeks away, I find myself wondering just what am I going to do with my original Nintendo Switch Lite? By the time that this video goes live, the Switch 2 will be less than a week away. So I've had enough people call me Mario in my last video that I thought I would look the part. Yeah, I'm recording. So I thought I would kick back and play some good old Legend of Zelda, but Zelda 1 as it was released for the Nintendo Famicom. Nintendo re-released Zelda 1 on cartridge when the redesigned AV Famicom was released in Japan, and they literally called it Hiro no Densetsu 1, Zelda 1, because the game had previously been released on the Famicom Disk System. And I thought it would be appropriate because now we're trying to figure out what to do with the Nintendo Switch 1. Now, some people complained about me playing a game and making a YouTube video at the same time. So if you can't handle that, a link to my script is in the video description below, but Zelda 1 is much more chill. So my problem is I'm trying to figure out what am I going to do with my Nintendo Switch Lite. And I'm probably not going to be playing it quite as much since the Nintendo Switch 2 has most of the games backwards compatible. Option 1, sell it. So a popular option, it would be to sell it to a local game retailer, a used game retailer like Hawthorne Game Exchange or Total TOTL Games in Portland, Oregon, and then use the money to buy some Switch 1 games or Switch 2 games, or just use it to, I want to die, ooh. On my way to see a ferry on the way to see the ferry. And I can use it to buy my Switch 2. And this is an altruistic option because it helps awesome independent game stores have stock to sell, and then they can turn around and sell it to make it accessible to people that might not be able to afford a Nintendo Switch through other ways. Let's see, I've gone first 2 dungeons, so might as well do the third. System data transfer. So when you set up to transfer data from one Nintendo Switch system to another, it will format the memory on the old system, and it will then perform a factory reset. It's possible to have your Nintendo Switch account logged into a total of 2 different Switch systems. So if you decide to migrate over your Switch, you'll have to log back into your old system in order to access your games and such. So if you really wanted to trade it into the shop, it's all ready to go do that at that point. Option 2. Another option is just keep it. Keep your original Nintendo Switch or Nintendo Switch Lite in my case, and use it to play the Switch 1 library of games. Now, I have an original Game Boy, and I have a Game Boy Pocket, and I have a Game Boy Color, and a Game Boy Advance, and a Game Boy Advance SP, both original and one heavily modded. And I even have a Game Boy Micro, but each system has their own flavor profile and mouthfeel. God, I almost didn't want to say that. So each system has a different experience of playing it. So my Switch only goes up to 720p, but damn, does it look great. It is small and compact and fun to use. And I misplaced the original charger, or I think I gave it to someone. And so I just end up charging it with the various USB chargers that I have around my place. So just keeping it and using it to play Nintendo Switch 1 games while using the Nintendo Switch Online to sync data in between the 2 systems is definitely an attractive option. My cat is yelling at me and wanting to go outside, so if you hear a cat screaming, but I already took him outside. So I don't need the money. I'm getting to at that point in life where I can get the extra avocado or extra burger patty if I want, so I do not have to sell my original Switch to afford to get a Switch 2. So I'm not rich, but there are times where in the past I've sold my old game system to afford new game hardware, and I almost always have inevitably regretted it. I regret selling my TurboGrafx 16, Neo Geo Pocket Color, and Sega CD. Using multiple Switch systems. Got to deal with the dark nuts. Used up my bombs with the previous boss. So when you have a Nintendo Switch Online subscription, you can set up data sync and sync your game saves to the cloud. And so this is definitely an option for people who want to maintain two systems, either original or one original system and one Nintendo Switch 2. So with the whole virtual game card thing, Nintendo sort of introduced an artificial limit of two systems that can actually be used with one digital game purchase. They seem to want to be encouraging a household to buy multiple copies of the game for multiple kids with multiple Switch systems. This cat has no chill. So hopefully, if I pick him up and give him all the attention, he's going to stop yelling at me while I do the recording. Just a little bit of chill. So if you have two Nintendo Switch systems, you're not going to have any problem having digital-only games. But if you have three family members, each with their own Switch, you're going to run into problems. Keycard conspiracy. Perhaps this is what they intended with the whole keycards and the fake cartridges that are download codes thing. I'm not going to I got hit. I'm not going to suggest that they're a diabolical plot to get, this is where it gets tough. So I'm not going to suggest that they're a diabolical plot to get Nintendo fans with multiple kids to buy the same game multiple times, but you never know. And I'm out of spot of bombs. So another theory about the prevalence of keycards. And I died. I was paying attention to my script and I died. So another theory about the prevalence of third-party keycards actually comes from an internal email from Arc System Works. So with the original Nintendo Switch, Nintendo would have 3 different cartridge models with different file sizes that they could offer third-party developers. So they could opt for a cartridge that closely met their game's file size. So it would be cheaper for a third-party publisher who had a 10 gig Switch game to get their cartridge manufactured for Nintendo than using a 64 gig cartridge. So apparently the choice that Nintendo is offering third-party developers is limited to one 64 gig cartridge and keycards that don't have a significant amount of game data on them. And this is a problem because too many third-party developers are choosing keycards to pass the inconvenience of digital downloads tied to a physical cartridge onto gamers. And I made an entire video on this. And so in order for Nintendo to turn away from this anti-consumer cliff that is keycards, they need to start offering third-party game developers the option of putting their game on a Switch 2 cartridge that have a smaller capacity than 64 gig. Because if they have to choose between 64 gigs and an empty keycard, then game publishers are picking keycards, but they are gambling on the presumption that there's not going to be a consumer backlash against keycards. So I am not going to buy any keycards, and if I had to choose between my PS4 copy of Yakuza 0 and replaying it, or shelling out for an empty keycard that's going to require me to have a giant download and use a big chunk of my limited file storage, replaying that game on PS4 is starting to look pretty good now. And so it sort of feels like developers are trying to see if they can get away with the whole keycard shenanigans. Problem with the Dark Nuts is that they change directions so often. Oh, it's great. The memory card problem. Oh man, this part. I am not going to kill these guys. I want to go to that dungeon. See if I can get to those stairs. Okay, work over here. And I got it. Got the raft. So I only have a handful of original Switch games physically, and when I got my Switch Lite, I got a 512 gigabyte memory card, and I purchased most of my games digitally. And I mostly opted for indie games or retro games that are lower in file size, but they add up. And I purchased a couple games physically on Switch card. I only have 151 gigs of storage space left on that SD memory card. So even if I get a Switch 2 and a 256 gig memory card, I would only have 80 gigs or so left for Switch 2 games, and that is clearly not going to cut the mustard. I got the map, and I can see that it's a Manju. Ironically, now that the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2 is weeks away, I am more likely to play Nintendo Switch 1 games on card than ever before. One problem is that I bought some big Nintendo Switch games digitally because I had half a terabyte of storage in my Switch Lite, and I thought that file storage problems were a thing of the past. How naive I was. Moving my game data to a Switch 2. Boy, what do I kill with some bombs right now. So I also don't want to fill up the single memory card slot with a relatively low capacity 256 gig SD Express card. So while the Switch 2 has 256 gigs of data for internal storage, should have got some bombs. Let's see. Oh, continue. All right, I'm going to try and get some bombs. So that is going to be the card that most people get. However, based on factors that I covered in my other video, I don't think it's going to be enough. And I'm going to try to hold out for a price drop on the 1 or 2 terabyte of SD Express cards once supply starts to meet demand. I am woefully under... Oh, there's a bomb. Great. I am farming for bombs. So it's fascinating now that in 2025, we're considering 256 gigs of data to be a relatively low amount of data. I mean, like it is, but it's not. The problem with Switch 2 memory card searches on Amazon. So while I'm on the subject of SD cards, I wanted to mention something troubling that I noticed. When you go to Amazon and you search for Nintendo Switch 2 memory cards, most of the results are sponsored search results for regular SD memory cards, which will not work on a Nintendo Switch 2. The Switch 2 requires faster SD Express memory cards, and those cards are in short supply. So Amazon will sell search results to the highest bidder, and there are retailers that are taking advantage of this by having their listing for regular cards that are not compatible with a Switch 2 show up when you enter a search phrase looking for a Switch 2 compatible memory card. And to make matters worse, some of these cards are actually licensed by Nintendo and have freaking Mario or Yoshi or mushrooms on them. So I would like to think that my viewers are technically adept and realize that a memory card needs to be specifically marked micro SD EX, not EC, or have a semi-deceptive title of extreme or gamer memory. I sort of think that the Nintendo Switch appeals to the not quite technically adept moms and dads and kids who might fall for this trap. And I really hope that they aren't going to accidentally buy an incompatible memory card and then be stuck with it. And if that happens, I think they're going to blame Nintendo or more than Amazon or the deceptive seller. Okay, a bomb. Thank you. I needed that. Now I get my bombs up to 8. So parents were always salty about new Nintendo systems. Heck, I remember when they introduced the Super Nintendo, parents were upset that you couldn't play Super Nintendo games on the original system or NES games on a Super NES. So at least the Switch 2 is mostly backwards compatible. Killed some Octoroks, unalive some Octoroks. I'm gonna go back to the dungeon. Currently, I don't think I'm ready to give up my awesome banana yellow Nintendo Switch Lite quite yet. It is freaking awesome for retro games and pretty darn good at playing them. And I like its sleek form factor and excellent D-pad, and the screen is darn bright and attractive. And I think it's the ultimate game system for playing games in bed. I'm not quite ready to be nostalgic for the Nintendo Switch Lite. But I think that'll happen eventually, but I'm not ready to move on from it quite yet. Of course, the one thing that it cannot do is play games on a TV via HDMI. So I think by getting a Switch 2 with a dock, I'll have that particular problem solved. So I definitely think that using the Nintendo Switch Online service to sync game data is attractive for a player that wants to play on multiple Switch systems. Use that beam sword. Got you. Stab you through the wall. I do not like the dark nuts. So for a long time, I've sort of been resistant to paying Nintendo $20 a year or $50 for the expanded game system, since I like to play my games on original console or FPGA. But as long as I'm making videos for the general population, it would be pretty cool to see what Nintendo Switch Online games are like, because a lot of my viewers are going to be playing their classic games on the official Nintendo emulation apps. So until I'm ready to upgrade my Switch 2 storage capacity, I think the best way to utilize the ½ terabyte of storage that I have in my Switch Lite is to keep my Nintendo Switch Lite system and use it to play Switch 1 games. Bam! Come on, yeah! So, however, for the games that I want to play on my TV, I'm going to download the Switch 1 games to my Switch 2 on an as-needed basis, not just to try and bring the entire library over. This is also because I cannot do that even with an optional 256 gig memory card and still have space for Switch 2 games. So I think a lot of people are going to be selling their original Nintendo Switch systems once they get a Switch 2 upgrade, especially after it factory resets the original systems when you move your data over. And a lot of people, that would be perfectly fine, but not for me. I am an eclectic retro video game nerd with a YouTube channel, so I am going to keep both of them. Well, I hope you enjoyed my talk on what to do with the Nintendo Switch 1 after you upgrade to a Switch 2. If you like this video, then you should really consider subscribing to this channel. Definitely hit the like button, because that tells the YouTube algorithm overlords that you like this video, and that definitely helps this channel out. This is 8-Bit Joystick. Stay awesome. Play retro.